Hi, I'm Father Dylan Schrader. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Jefferson City in Missouri, a pastor of St. Joseph Parish in Westphalia and St. Anthony of Padua Parish in Folk, Missouri, and I'm the author of an article, Theological Notes and Censures, for the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, ect.org. In this presentation, we'll talk about the history of theological notes and censures, the relationship among theological notes, censures, and qualifications. We'll distinguish theological, moral, and canonical considerations, talk about who can assign theological notes, discuss individual notes and censures, talk about why theological notes are useful, look at the relationship of theological notes to the analogy of faith, discuss what happened to theological notes after the Second Vatican Council, and finally look at current usage by the Magisterium. A theological note is a brief description of how a proposition relates to divine revelation. Often that description includes the relationship of the proposition to the Magisterium and to the science of theology. So, for example, the note, Dogma of Divine and Catholic Faith, expresses that a proposition has been revealed by God and has been taught by the Magisterium as revealed. This also tells us that that proposition calls for the response of theological faith. There are many other theological notes that have been used throughout history and that are in current usage by the Magisterium today. The history of theological notes really begins with censures, that is, with negative notes, indicating that a certain proposition is to be rejected. This is because in the beginning, the Church's concern was to defend the Orthodox faith. We see that concern evident already in sacred scripture. For example, when St. Paul says that if I or an angel from heaven should preach a different gospel to you than the one you've received, anathema sit, let him be anathema. The concern for protecting the integrity of the faith required the Church, especially through her bishops, to identify certain teachings that were incompatible with what had been received from the apostles. Over time, as we get to the Middle Ages, rather than simply rejecting as false certain propositions, we begin to see a more fine-grained approach where different propositions are identified either as heretical or perhaps as simply erroneous or as badly expressed and things along those lines. Through the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, theological notes and censures began to develop in great detail so that we have dozens of ways of categorizing how different propositions relate to what God has revealed, both in a positive sense, those that agree with divine revelation, and in a negative sense, those that are incompatible with it. It's also in the late Middle Ages, especially with William of Ockham and following, that we begin to see an actual study in the science of theology, both of the role of the Magisterium and of theological notes and censures in particular. As we get into the more modern period, the manuals of theology that were in common usage often would identify individual theses in their manuals with particular notes. So they would assign a note to the thesis they were defending to describe for the reader the place that they felt that proposition held within the science of Catholic theology. And in the more contemporary magisterium, while we don't see the heavy use of censures, of negative theological notes, as we did in the early church, we do see the use of positive notes to advance Catholic teaching and to highlight certain truths. So, for example, the definition of the Assumption of Mary as a dogma of faith, something which had been accepted as true for a very long time, now being identified as something that is itself divinely revealed. In the last few centuries, there's been a shift in the way that the Magisterium has actually exercised its teaching authority, focusing not so much on the condemnation of errors, but on the positive promotion of Catholic teaching. We see this also in areas such as identifying certain propositions as dogmas of faith, not because they were being challenged or doubted, but simply for the honor of God and to help promote and develop these areas within the science of theology. So, for example, the definition of Mary's Assumption, which had always been held, always been affirmed as true, The definition of that as a dogma of faith in 1950 is assigning a higher theological note to that teaching. We also see in the Second Vatican Council that there's a move away from using anathemas, from identifying false propositions, to promoting teachings in a more positive form in the council documents. When you read theologians from different time periods, there's a huge variety in the vocabulary that they use to describe theological notes. So nota, note, qualificatio, qualification, censura, censure, but also valor dogmaticus, dogmatic value, and many other terms are in use. So it's important when reading a particular author to understand how they're using these terms. Today, we tend to use the word note for something that identifies the relationship of a proposition to divine revelation and the magisterium in some way. So in that sense, note is a more generic term. Within the genus of note, we would have censures, which are negative notes, identifying that a proposition is in some way incompatible with divine revelation, and positive notes, qualifications, which identify that a proposition is compatible with divine revelation. And within those two species, there are also many different examples and varieties. It's important when discussing theological notes to distinguish theological, moral, and canonical considerations. So when we're discussing theological notes, we're talking specifically about the theological consideration. However, confusingly, the same terms are sometimes used in the science of theology, in moral theology, and in canon law. So an example would be a word like heresy. The purely theological consideration of heresy is that we're identifying a proposition that contradicts something that is divinely revealed and has been taught as divinely revealed. So from a theological perspective, we're talking simply about the truth value of a proposition in terms of how it relates to something God has said. However, of course, affirming heresy and doing so deliberately and knowingly would be a sin, a serious sin. And so we can also evaluate that the action of heresy from a moral perspective. And so moral theologians will discuss the sin of heresy. And further, canon lawyers will discuss the crime of heresy. So someone who's committed the sin of heresy under certain conditions might have committed the canonical crime of heresy, which has certain penalties attached to it, such as excommunication. It's important to keep in mind that while these things might be related, especially in concrete circumstances, they are distinct speculatively. So someone who holds a heretical proposition is not necessarily guilty of the sin of heresy, and someone who commits the sin of heresy is not necessarily guilty of the canonical crime of heresy. So it's important to keep in mind that while the theological, moral, and canonical aspects of what we believe and the propositions that we hold or don't hold are related, they are also distinct. So who can assign theological notes? Properly speaking, the Magisterium has the authority to assign theological notes. So, for example, in the definition of the Immaculate Conception or the definition of the Assumption, we have the notes dogma of divine and Catholic faith defined, being assigned to the propositions that were so defined. But also, in general, theologians have the freedom to assign theological notes according to their own views. So one theologian might evaluate a certain proposition as common opinion, another might evaluate it as Catholic teaching, and so forth. Occasionally, the Magisterium will intervene and put limits on the kinds of notes that theologians are allowed to assign. So famously, in the De Auxiliis controversy over the mechanism of predestination and grace, the Magisterium intervened and did not permit either side to call the other side heretical for their views. Now let's talk about individual notes and censures. Theologians differ in the details of how they assign individual notes and censures. What I'm presenting here is a relatively common schema drawn especially from the work of Father Sisto Cartaccini. And I'm going to present these in roughly descending order of level of authority. So At the highest level of authority, we have dogmas of faith, or dogmas of divine and Catholic faith. That is something that God himself has revealed and that the Church has taught as divinely revealed. To deny one of these would be something that incurs the censure of heresy. In second place, we have propositions that are sometimes called of ecclesiastical faith. And there's a little bit of a disagreement among theologians as to whether this is a legitimate category or not, but it is in use by many theologians. So a teaching of ecclesiastical faith is one that the Church has taught in a definitive way as something the faithful must hold, but not as something that God himself has directly revealed. So teachings in this category would be things that are connected with divine revelation by some kind of necessity. Today, we tend to use the expression de fide tenenda to describe teachings in this category, but in older theological works, the expression of ecclesiastical faith might be used. There are also teachings of divine faith, as opposed to of divine and Catholic faith. These are teachings that God has revealed, but that the Magisterium has not yet taught as divinely revealed. So, for example, propositions that are found clearly in sacred scripture, but that the Church has never had occasion to propose explicitly and individually to the faithful. There are teachings that are proximate to faith. These would be propositions that theologians pretty much unanimously consider to be divinely revealed, but that have not yet been taught as such. So those are the kind of things that at some point might be defined as dogmas of faith down the road, but have not yet been so defined. There are propositions that are considered theologically certain, and these are inferences drawn partly from divine revelation, but also partly from other sources of knowledge. So from philosophy or history or other areas of knowledge. So a proposition that's theologically certain involves something that's revealed and something that's not revealed that are put together to draw out some new truth, and that therefore has certainty but can't be described as something that God himself has revealed. There are teachings that are simply called Catholic teaching or Catholic doctrine, and these are not taught as divinely revealed, but they are taught by the Church. And there are many examples of things that fall into this category, things that are common Catholic teaching, but that have not yet been defined or explicitly proposed as divine revelation. Getting into some of the lower level notes, we have things like certain, common and certain, morally certain. This would be things that theologians are generally agreed upon. So, for example, if you have a idea that different theological schools of thought agree upon, then you'd have the common opinion of theologians. If the Scotists, the Thomists, and the Suarezans and everybody can agree on something, it's probably at least a common opinion. There are propositions that are secure or safe. That is, that if you hold to this proposition, you're on safe ground. You're not in danger of offending against something God has revealed. And then we simply descend into the realm of the more common or more probable opinions. These are generally theological opinions that have been held by individual theologians with decent authority or that have good arguments behind them, but Catholics are free to embrace them or to embrace alternatives as well. When we look at the censures, the negative theological notes that have been in use by the Magisterium and by theologians, it's important to keep several things in mind. So first of all, the use of the word anathema, for example, doesn't always indicate heresy. Sometimes anathema just means that there's the possibility of a canonical penalty or some serious consequences attached to teaching a certain thing or doing a certain thing. There are other kinds of censures that have been used. So sometimes error in faith. Error in faith would be identifying a proposition that contradicts something that's taken to be in divine revelation, but that the Magisterium has not yet explicitly stated as divinely revealed. So if a theologian thinks that something is clearly taught in sacred scripture, the contradiction of that would be an error in faith, even if the Magisterium has not yet defined that as divinely revealed. Proposition that is proximate to error means that you're getting close to an error in faith, or you're getting close to heresy in some way. So this would be a proposition that contradicts something that theologians generally hold to be divinely revealed. So it's a high likelihood of error in faith. An error in theology is the denial of a proposition that's considered theologically certain. So in contrast to an error in faith, where you're denying something that is taken to be divinely revealed, even if not taught as such, an error in theology is the denial of something that's taken to be theologically certain, which involves the combination of something revealed and something non-revealed. So it indicates a failure in the practice of theological science. Propositions that are rash or temerarious are ones that run the risk of error. That is, you would be going beyond the bounds of what it is safe to teach or safe to hold if you were to hold these kinds of propositions. So, for example, putting forward a totally new theological opinion that doesn't have a sufficient foundation to it. This censure indicates a lack of due caution in the practice of theological science. The Magisterium and theologians have also historically used a wide variety of other kinds of censures. So, for instance, offensive to pious ears, a statement that is irreverent or inappropriate for prudent Christian sensibilities. It might be technically true, but it's offensive to say. And it's important to remember that not everything that is true should be said, or should be said publicly. A statement that is bad sounding, male sonans, is one that is likely to mislead. So a statement that might be technically true in some way, but that people are going to take in the wrong way. And such a statement is not just badly expressed, it's also harmful to people's faith, and therefore is bad theology, because theology's purpose is to aid people in their faith. A statement that is scandalous is one that's likely to lead people into sin or to discourage the active practice of the faith. So this could be by instilling doubt, skepticism, cynicism, could be by disparaging good religious practices, such as by discouraging devotions like the rosary or discouraging religious orders or things like that. Those propositions are scandalous because they harm people in the practice of their faith. A statement that smacks of heresy, or one that tastes of heresy, is one that might not technically be heretical, or it has a non-heretical possible interpretation, but it gives good reason to suspect that the person putting it forward is actually secretly a heretic, secretly denying the faith. Statements that are ambiguous are ones that can be taken in a correct or in an incorrect way, and they're just not clear enough. And statements that are captious are ones that use correct sounding terminology, but do so in order to lead people into error. So why are theological notes useful? I would suggest they're useful for primarily two reasons. First, they give to the faithful a clear guidance as to what kind of assent we owe to different teachings of the church or different opinions of theologians. Not everything that we would broadly call church teaching is at the same level of authority. Some of it is definitive and irreformable. Some of it is provisional and possibly could be changed in the future. And how do we know which is which? Theological notes help us to determine that. And second, theological notes aid theologians in the science of theology. For example, by being able to communicate clearly to one another the place that they think individual propositions hold within the web of Catholic theology. So a great example would be the discussions leading up to the definition of Mary's assumption into heaven. Prior to the dogmatic definition in 1950, theologians held different opinions on the place that this truth held within the science of theology. So while all theologians were broadly agreed that Mary was assumed into heaven, not everyone agreed that that fact was divinely revealed. So some thought that it was simply a matter of historical fact, a thing that happened. Others thought it was of divine faith that is revealed by God, but at that time not yet proposed for the church as revealed by God. Others thought it was certain in theology, or at least certain opinion, or things like that. So being able to use theological notes allowed theologians to discuss with one another in very precise terms the place they felt that Mary's Assumption held within the web of Catholic teaching, ultimately paving the way for it to be defined as a dogma of faith. So how do theological notes relate to the analogy of faith? The analogy of faith is basically the fact that the truths that God has revealed, the Christian faith as a whole, constitutes a web, constitutes a set of things that are interrelated, that they're all connected. So by understanding our faith in one area, we can help our understanding in a different area. And because the truth cannot contradict the truth, something that we know, for example, in Christology, has to be compatible with what we know in sacramental theology or ecclesiology or Mariology and so forth. So the analogy of faith is basically this idea that the truths of our faith all fit together and mutually support and enrich one another. So how do theological notes relate to that? Well, it's precisely because revelation comes to us not exclusively in the form of propositions that we do need something like theological notes. So if God had just given to us revelation as a list of propositions, then those would be the propositions we'd have to believe, and we could reason about them and maybe draw out some inferences, but we'd be very limited in what we could express in the science of theology. But God has given us so much more. God has given us Jesus, who's his revelation in person. And certainly the way that revelation has been transmitted to us in scripture and tradition does contain propositional elements. So there are propositions that are taught to us, for example, in sacred scripture, such as, this is my body, this is the chalice of my blood. But there's also much more. And so the deposit of faith comes to us as a complex, as a gift that contains within it propositional aspects, but also images, also relationships, also typology, and many other things. So theological notes help us as we're elaborating into propositional form this much more rich complex of the deposit of faith. So as we're trying to put into precise words to articulate precisely what it is we believe as Catholics, theological notes help us to do that. So a great example would be something like the definition of Mary's Immaculate Conception. You're not going to find the dogma of the Immaculate Conception as a proposition stated explicitly in sacred scripture. What you're going to find is the presentation of Mary as a person who is uniquely full of grace and uniquely related to Christ in the new covenant. And so as theologians begin to ask the question, well, just how full of grace is Mary? Just how redeemed by Christ is she, and in what manner? The propositions that come out of that, such as Mary was conceived without any stain of original sin, can be assigned theological notes, in this case, dogma of divine and Catholic faith. Precisely because there's a richness to the faith as it's been given to us, we need something like theological notes to help us as we elaborate that into a precisely articulated propositional form. So I'd like to share a quote from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 90, itself quoting the Second Vatican Council, Unitatis Redintegratio. The mutual connections between dogmas and their coherence can be found in the whole of the revelation of the mystery of Christ. In Catholic doctrine, there exists an order or hierarchy of truths, since they vary in their relation to the foundation of the Christian faith. So within this complex that God has revealed to us, and as we articulate that into propositional form, some teachings or some truths are more foundational than others, which doesn't mean that they're more true, that they have more truth than something else, but it does mean that they're more basic. So certain truths depend on other truths. For instance, the truth that Mary is the mother of God depends upon the truth of the incarnation, that the Son of God took on a real human nature. And so as we use theological notes to explore in propositional form the teachings of our faith that are contained in this deposit of faith, we can also use them to identify the relationship of one truth to another. Is something divinely revealed, or is something a consequence of something that is divinely revealed, for example? The fate of theological notes after the Second Vatican Council. The manuals of the late 19th and early 20th century made heavy use of theological notes. After all, theological manuals were presenting propositions or theses in textbook form. And so in addition to stating the thesis and giving arguments for and against it, the author would often assign a note, the level of teaching authority that he thought that particular thesis held. Vatican II made a move to get away from the manualistic way of teaching the faith, and following the Second Vatican Council, theological manuals disappeared almost entirely. So along with them, theological notes fell into disuse. However, the Magisterium continued to make use of certain theological notes, and even the International Theological Commission called for a revival of the practice of theological notes. So as we get into the late 80s and early 90s, we do find a deliberate revival of the use of theological notes, specifically at 3 levels by the Magisterium. At the same time that the formal use of theological notes fell out of disuse following Vatican II, there was great interest in identifying just how binding certain church teachings might be. Some wanted to do this because they wanted to compare teachings after Vatican II to those before Vatican II to see whether there was continuity or rupture. And others wanted to explore how binding certain teachings might be because they were looking to affirm freedom of conscience for the faithful to reject those teachings if possible. And so even though theological notes were not being used as widely in a formal sense, there was still the same interest in identifying particular teachings and deciding what level of authority they might hold. Some theologians even put forward the idea that only infallibly defined dogmas of faith actually have to be held by the faithful, and that all other church teachings at lower levels of authority are essentially optional. The Magisterium, of course, did not agree with that. So how are theological notes used by the Magisterium today? Today, generally speaking, there are 3 levels of church teaching that are identified with explicit notes. So there are dogmas de fide credenda, the faith to be believed. There are doctrines de fide tenenda, the faith to be held. And then beneath those, broadly, teachings to which religious submission of will and intellect is owed. So the highest level, dogmas de fide credenda, these are truths that are revealed by God and that the Magisterium has taught as revealed by God, either by a defining act, such as in an ecumenical council or the Pope speaking ex cathedra, or even by a non-defining act, such as by the ordinary and universal magisterium. So when the bishops of the world either gathered in council, or the Pope himself speaking ex cathedra, or the bishops of the world in union with the Pope, but not formally gathered in council, whenever they're agreed on something that must be held by the faithful definitively as something revealed by God, that's a dogma de fide credenda. In contrast, a doctrine de fide tenenda is one that the Church has taught in a definitive way, that is, as definitively to be held. So firm assent is required, firm and irrevocable assent is required, but the teaching has not yet been taught as revealed by God. The teachings in this category are those that are connected to divine revelation, either by historical or logical necessity. So an example of a teaching currently at this level would be the reservation of the priesthood to men only. which the Magisterium has not yet taught as something God has directly revealed, but has taught as essentially connected with the institution of the sacraments by Christ. So doctrines de fide tenenda are just as true as dogmas de fide credenda and must be held definitively, but the difference is whether something is directly revealed by God or whether something is connected with something revealed by God. Finally, we have, broadly speaking, many teachings of the Pope and the bishops to which we owe religious submission of will and intellect. These are teachings that, strictly speaking, are not definitive, so they're not being put forward in a way that is permanently binding, but they are authoritative. So the Pope and the bishops have the authority to teach even when they're not making a final decision that's totally irrevocable. So, strictly speaking, it's possible for certain teachings in this category to be false. They might be reformed later on. However, we still owe a certain submission to them, not merely an external submission of just respectful silence or obedience, but even an internal assent of our will and intellect out of deference to the authority that Christ has given to the apostles and their successors. So, less definitive teachings or less authoritative teachings fall into this category, those to which we owe religious submission of will and intellect. Teachings in the categories de fide credenda and de fide tenenda are covered by the charism of infallibility, meaning that when they're taught in such a way, God will not allow the faithful to be bound to hold definitively or believe definitively something that is in fact false. And so God will protect the church from error when teaching at those levels of authority. It's also important to remember that the Pope and the bishops, while they hold a teaching office, are also still human beings, and many of them are still theologians and very good theologians. So sometimes they're exercising their formal teaching office, and sometimes they're just putting forward their personal opinion. So a great example of that is when Pope Benedict XVI issued his books on Jesus of Nazareth, which he didn't intend to be papal teaching, but intended to be his own personal seeking the face of the Lord and his own personal opinions as a theologian. So whenever we're evaluating church teachings, we always have to be mindful of the level of assent that's being asked for us. And sometimes it's no level of assent at all. It's just a matter of personal opinion. Other times, it may be a non-definitive, but still authoritative teaching that's being put out. So an example would be John Paul II's catechesis on Genesis or the theology of the body in his Wednesday audiences, much of which is put forward in a non-definitive way, but it's still being put forward as papal teaching, and therefore we owe a religious submission of will and intellect to it. I think theological notes and censures are important not only for reading historical sources, but also for the discussion today, to keep in mind what is church teaching, what is not church teaching, and what is the state of the question. So on just the ordinary level, sometimes we get confused about that. The media, for example, might publish a headline saying the Pope said X, Y, and Z. And as Catholics, we need to know, is this an authoritative teaching? Is this a definitive teaching? Is this even a teaching at all? Are we being given the reality of what the church is asking us to accept and to believe? And at the same time, theologians need to be able to discuss with one another what is the place that different truths hold within the web of Catholic teaching, and how can we develop and move forward? So some of the live questions today are about the development of doctrine and the extent to which what we believe as Catholics can be re-expressed, or what we have traditionally taught, to what extent can that be changed? When is development real development? When is it changed into something unrecognizable? Theological notes and censures are a sort of meta tool that allow us to discuss these things with greater precision by identifying the way in which individual propositions relate to what God has revealed, relate to what the church has taught, tell us what level of authority should be attached to them, and tell us the place that they hold within the deposit of faith or within theological science. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If you'd like to learn more about theological notes and censures, you can consult my article on the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology, ect.org.